One.
Welcome to the Daily Objective. We were actually going to talk about Israel sometime this week or next week in a different context. The judicial reform in Israel that's highly controversial, that the what's being referred to as the most right-wing government in Israel's history is trying to pass, and it's pretty bad. We'll talk about it at some point. And the opposition to it, there's massive protests, supposedly the biggest in Israel's history. And I think the protesters are also pretty bad, and talk about that as well. But we won't talk about it today because as happens more and more often, there's another round in Israel and in the Gaza Strip. Rockets are showering over Israeli population. Israel does its half-ass response of bombing some trees and stuff. And so a little bit of background, and people who have seen episodes with me in the past about these rounds know that I don't like getting into these details because the details don't actually matter at all. But the details, just briefly, are there was this. So there's Hamas, everybody knows them. There's Islamic Jihad, which is like the second biggest terrorist organization in Gaza. One of their people was in an Israeli prison. He went on a hunger strike. He died, as can happen if you don't eat, and they were upset about it, and they, expressed their being upset in a way that they often do before they start showering Israel with rockets. Then Israel killed a few of their leaders. Then the rockets started. I think there's over 1,000 rockets in the 4 or 5 days of this operation so far. Luckily for Israel, and it's luck, it's nothing else. They're not very good, and the rockets aren't very sophisticated, so they usually don't hit, or they're usually shot, or often shot down. One person did die yesterday. Several were injured. And Israel does its thing where if you watch Israeli television, which I do because I speak Hebrew, you'll see all these both experts and people from the Israeli military and the Israeli government talking, and this happens every time, talking about how this operation has already had great results, great achievements. They're referring to the killing of the leaders, several of the leaders of Islamic Jihad.
Well, they did kill two of the top leaders, right?
Yeah, I think at this point they just killed another one today and another one yesterday. I think they're at 5. I don't know how I don't know the details of the structure. I don't know how high up they are, but Israel refers to them as leaders of Islamic Jihad, which is great. Always great to kill terrorists.
It's something.
But there's something bizarre about seeing people talking about great achievements of an operation by a strong military against a group of people who build, rockets in their bathtub, and are managing to shoot these rockets all over Israel's population. It doesn't feel like an achievement if you're in Israel hiding from rockets every few minutes. It doesn't look like an achievement if you're looking from afar and you know that Israel can actually eliminate this threat in a very short period of time. This is an ongoing thing that it happens, as I mentioned, more and more frequently. In the past, there were a few years between them. Now there's much less than that. I don't want to give my prediction of where this is going, but I don't think this is going well for Israel. And by the way, one more thing in my rant before we go to James. One of the things the experts talk about is, so-called experts on Israeli television, is how the longer this goes, the worse it's going to be for Israel, which is another thing that I don't really understand. I mean, why is that? If Yeah. The implication is that they're going to shoot more rockets. There's more of a chance that these rockets will hit. But again, it's like nobody realizes that Israel actually has the power to win this. And nobody uses the word victory. So, James.
Oh, boy, you hit on so many great issues there. And you're right. When we get down into the details at this point, they really don't matter. The big picture is more than enough to develop the moral situation here. Back between 1967 and 68, the Arab neighbors of Israel did this massive military buildup and were starting to launch an attack against Israel's very existence. And none of those countries, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, even recognized Israel's right to exist. Israel, of course, kicked their tails. They took the West Bank, they took the Gaza Strip, they took Sinai from Egypt, they took the Golan Heights. But those places had been used and were going to be used as launching places for the attack on Israel by nations that refused to accept its right to exist. From that moment forward, Israel had a right to totally annex the West Bank and Gaza, period, forever. That's it. I mean, the very fact that by the late 1970s, Israel was giving Sinai back to Egypt because Egypt was willing to recognize Israel's right to exist, I mean, that was generosity of appeasement almost, in my thought, on the part of Israel. They hadn't, it was insufficient at that point that Israel had achieved its security, because here we are now, 40 years later, still getting a rain of missiles on Israel. But in any event, there is, let me put it this way, no right to give these, that these people have to have this territory so that they can continuously launch attacks on Israel when they refuse to acknowledge Israel's right to exist. And it's just madness. It is absolute madness. When you back up and you look at it further, in the 1990s, Bill Clinton pressured the PLO under Yasser Arafat, and Israel once more was willing to grant Palestinians an independent state. But Yasser Arafat refused. There was the repatriation issue, but they could have negotiated the repatriation. But oh, no way. Israel was willing to do that. Yasser Arafat was still refusing to recognize Israel. They could have had peaceful coexistence had they wanted it 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago. They've refused it every time, and they continue to rain rockets upon Israel. They have long since lost any moral legitimate claim to Gaza, the Golan Heights, or the West Bank, period, in my view. Israel has every moral right to wipe out Islamic Jihad as well as Hamas in the Gaza Strip and just wipe them out. How many innocent, I understand that places that hadn't previously been reached by these Palestinian rockets were victims in Israel this time around. Well, how long does Israel have to endure this? How long do they have to endure this with people who say they want to destroy Israel? Just as a matter of simple negotiation, I would refuse to negotiate with anyone who did not accept my right to exist. It's a precondition. If we share no principles or common goals, any negotiation is appeasement and an evil compromise, the kind of compromise that evil requires to exist. If these people won't acknowledge Israel's right to exist, Israel and America should never be negotiating with them, ever. It should be a precondition of any kind of no. First of all, stop the violence, period. Full stop. And you must recognize Israel's right to exist. And if those aren't preconditions, it's insane to even think about negotiating with people who do. I mean, it's completely over the line. And how long does this have to go on? How long must innocent Israelis die before something serious happens? And of course, Israel has been talking about ceasefires, and of course, more missiles will come down. All of the humanitarian suffering that people complain about in the Gaza Strip, for example, is the fault of the Palestinians. all of the collateral damage that occurs when Islamic Jihad leaders recently got killed, but there may have been civilians as well. That collateral damage is the fault of the Palestinians. They could have brought all of this to an end decades ago. Their continued violence, their continued failure to recognize Israel makes negotiation impossible and gives Israel every right to wipe out the PLO and Islamic Jihad altogether and to remove them completely from Gaza and the West Bank. It seems to me the moral clarity on this issue is precisely what's lacking. And it's altruism, it's appeasement on the worst kind of scale. They demand altruism from Israel. And unfortunately, so much of the conservatives in the Israeli government, seeking, ceasefire after ceasefire. Oh, just give us a little peace here, give us a little peace there. It's a total corruption as far as I can see. They should never be negotiating with these people.
And you ask how long, Israelis have to endure this. Well, as long as they choose to, or as long as their governments choose to, because that is Israel's, continued choice. And yeah, you mentioned, and I also mentioned, this is considered the most right-wing government in Israel's history. The one thing that all governments in Israel are consistent on in the past, several decades, is that whenever they take military action against any group among the Palestinians, their top concern has to be to avoid civilian deaths on the other side, to the extent that means the death of Israeli soldiers. I mean, this current operation has so far only involved aerial bombardments on Israel's part, no ground operation, but a ground operation will result in Israeli deaths, and Israel will use that in their propaganda as showcasing their altruism. Israel fights in the most altruistic way of any military, probably in history, and again, all governments
trying to let one Israeli soldier die to avoid civilian casualties that are the fault of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They are the ones responsible for their own. They have an intentional policy of protecting their sites with civilians by putting them in hospitals and schools, putting women and children around the facilities. The Palestinians do that on purpose. On purpose. Now, in the face of that kind of policy, in the face of that kind of continued aggression, it is a moral crime to let one Israeli soldier die because of this so-called collateral damage, to reduce the civilian impact, which is the fault of Islamic Jihad and Hamas. If there are innocent people, believe me, that's already in my head kind of a theoretical proposition. Let's assume that there are innocent civilians there who aren't cheerleading Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, but let's assume there's innocent civilians. Their deaths are the responsibility, just as any humanitarian suffering going on in the Gaza Strip is the fault of these Palestinians. It's not the fault of Israel. They could have had peace decades ago. The collateral damage is all their fault. And to allow one Israeli soldier to die and to say, no, that's preferable to these civilians that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are putting in jeopardy is a moral obscenity in my view.
So I would take that further and say that the fact that civilians, let Islamic Jihad this time around and Hamas in other rounds fire rockets from their buildings is obviously, if armed terrorists come to your building, you don't really want to argue with them. But that's the problem. If Israel was more aggressive to the point where the civilian population in Gaza was actually suffering the consequences of the rockets fired at Israel, they would think twice. What Israel actually needs to do is to make the civilians in Gaza fear Israel's response more than they fear the terrorists coming to their home. They know that if they try to fight a terrorist, there's a risk of death. What they should also know is that if they don't fight off the terrorist, there's a certainty of death.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The cheering crowds of Palestinians who cheer on Hamas and Islamic Jihad that psychology has to be broken. And that means we go after civilians and make their life miserable. That's what we do. I don't know if I ever told you this story, Razi, but when I was a little boy, I had an older brother. And like a lot of younger brothers, maybe the age of 5 or 6, I punched my brother. I was a 5-year-old boy, and I punched my older brother in the arm. And my older brother very calmly turned to me and he said, "Now, Jimmy, I'm going to let you have that one. I'm going to let you have that one, but I'm going to tell you right now that if you ever hit me again, I'm going to hit you back 10 times harder." That is it left a big impression on me. I do not recall ever striking my older brother again, like a foolish younger brother. And that is the moral approach. That is the moral approach. If Israel wants to shower down 10 times, 100 times more violence upon Gaza, including hurting the civilians there, who are obviously largely in support of this violence, then so be it. If that's what's required to end the shower of missiles, that's what we do. And Israel, as you point out, has every capability of doing that. If they have to go in and clean out Gaza of all of these monsters and make the civilian population, in effect, suffer, so be it. So be it. They have richly earned it with their ongoing, decades-long, continuous murderous violence, which they could have stopped decades ago.
The problem with your story is when your brother said, "I'll let you have that one," that was it. Israel lets them have this one and then the next one and then basically everyone. And Israel threats, Israeli rhetoric is beautiful. They keep saying how they're going to kill the terrorists and at least the leadership. They've been doing that since since they brought in Arafat after the Oslo Accords, brought in his terrorists, armed them, and said, you are here to protect us. If that doesn't happen, we'll go in. Ever since then, ever since the mid 90s, Israel is letting the Palestinians have that one.
Totally pathetic appeasement. Oh no, they let them have that one, and then they let them have a second, and they let them have a third, and then they said, "Yes, let's keep negotiating. Let's have a ceasefire." No, that's the opposite of my brother's. My brother would have hit me back 10 times harder, and I knew it, and that's what deterred me. But if Israel doesn't strike back 10 times harder, which they have every ability. Look, remember back in the late 60s, they could take on Syria, Jordan, and Egypt all at the same time and kick their tails. They could easily, well, not easily, but they have plenty of power, take out the problem, at least in Gaza and the Golan Heights and most of the West Bank, and take care of the problem. But they don't. They don't. You're absolutely correct. They're far too worried about the collateral damage that is the fault of their own enemies. Insane to me.
Yeah, I mean, I would be happy with a strong retaliation against Islamic Jihad this time around, and Hamas anytime. You don't actually have to have them threaten or fire first. You can just say, okay, we've changed our mind. We're going after them. What I would also really like to see, although I think this is much less likely, is these organizations couldn't exist without the support of the mothership, which is Iran.
Iran. And we recently had attacks coming from the north that were not Hezbollah, were they? But all of these cats are being funded now, we know, from Iran, which has been the source, the fountainhead, not to misuse that beautiful word, which has been the evil fountainhead of nearly all of this material support that these monsters are getting. Yes. But of course, Europeans and all manner of other nations are always going to take the Palestinian side against Israel, always going to be demanding that Israel take more and give up more and coexist with killers more. I just don't get it. I really don't get it. It is a moral issue, and it comes down to altruism and appeasement and sanctioning of evil, because that's exactly what they demand of us. That is exactly what they demand. And evil only exists by our ongoing appeasement and sanctioning of evil. Ayn Rand had her finger exactly on this. Once you give up on that moral principle, it's just now like negotiating with the thieves over the spoons, right? When the guy breaks into your house. Now it's a question of how much of it, how many of your spoons he gets, not the principle that these are my spoons. And it's the same with the principle of violence here. So long as we appease them, so long as we keep saying, and the world keeps pressuring Israel to make peace with these monsters, blaming Israel for any humanitarian problem that the Palestinians are having, justifying the ongoing violence and the support they're getting from the monsters in Iran, the moral conditions of this world are what the problem is. These people
Yeah.
need a lesson in how to fight evil and what evil is. But
And you mentioned the response. I mean, when I look at Western media, how they cover Israel, especially when something like this happens, it really is disgusting. But as I mentioned, I watch Israeli news at least when something like this happens, and it's shocking. I mean, there's one channel in Israel that doesn't seem to hate Israel, but it's also very religious. So it's not exactly pro-Israel for the right reasons. But again,
but there's sort of an analogy with my own country, the United States here. The people who tend to support Israel, the people who might have a better defense policy, are religious conservatives. And they don't have a clear moral view about how violence and when violence can be used. In my country, the religious nuts are mostly Christians.
Yeah, by the way, the fact that Israel doesn't stand up for itself, I think also affects the fact that others aren't really that keen to support it. I mean, what goes on in the US is in large part, the cultural trends that are happening there anyway. But I was looking at Twitter yesterday for whatever reason, and I saw Rashida Tlaib saying something about. So she was. This was a couple of weeks ago when Israel had their Independence Day. She tweeted about the Nakba. Nakba is Arabic for, I believe, disaster. The disaster is the founding of the state of Israel. The fact that in the cesspool that is the Middle East, there's a state, where there's some freedom, there's, technological progress, there's safe space, so to speak, for Jews. Remember, the state was founded 3 years after, the Nazis exterminated 6 million.
The Holocaust, man. And for decades before that, Jewish and Zionist interests had been buying up legitimately most of the property that is today Israel. It's not as though the land was stolen. No, people like the Rothschilds for 100 years have been buying up most of the real estate that is Israel. And besides, as you point out, the governments around there were hereditary, theocratically based in most cases, dictatorships that had no legitimacy. So in the face of these kind of dictatorships that have no governmental legitimacy, an island of civilization, an island of comparative representative democracy and rights setting up there is perfectly legitimate. No, from the very beginning, the arguments against Israel were morally corrupt. That's the only way I have of looking at it. What can I say? If you can't see that all of these arguments that are made on behalf of the Palestinians are based on total moral corruption and a failure to recognize what's really going on there, until that happens, we won't have. That's right. Israel and the United States are never going to achieve the peace they want. And now, I mean, I loathe Trump. I never voted for Trump. I will never vote for Trump ever. One little asterisk I'll give him is that he treated Israel better than most American presidents treat Israel in that respect. And that's not a reason to, don't get me wrong, I'm not endorsing Trump here at all. But on the other hand, it takes moral clarity of a kind that we have not seen, and just a little moral clarity is a good thing. But once Trump leaves office, what do we see happening? Oh, well, the Saudis and the Iranians are now talking, sponsored by China. Isn't that lovely?
So, I mean, I think Trump's approach to Israel, which I don't know what his reasons were for supporting Israel, but Israel, had 4 years where they kind of had more leeway. Israel likes to complain about, the U.S. not fully supporting it. They're complaining about Biden now, justifiably. Biden
Well,
refuses to meet Netanyahu, which is shocking, considering he meets much worse people. As much as I'm not a fan of Netanyahu, but the fact that Israel during Trump's time in office, even under Netanyahu, didn't think of actually taking advantage of that. Actually, going after Palestinian terrorist organizations with more military might, going after Hezbollah, potentially going after Iran, shows that Israel, I think, likes to be in this position, or position, or at least the leadership of Israel likes to not take responsibility and pass the ball to whoever is going to be next. And yeah, at some point, this will end badly, as mentioned.
It doesn't yet look like there's a good happy ending here, and it is a great example of sanction of the evil. Israel and the United States have been sanctioning the evil in the Islamic world for decades and decades now, when they don't have to, when they have plenty of power to stop it and push back, and at least mostly end the violence in and around Israel, but they won't do it. And altruism and sanction of the evil is really what it comes down to. These people do not know how to defend. First of all, their moral principles aren't objective, and so they don't approach them with confidence and objectivity. And their moral principles have nothing to do with identifying who the killers are and who the people and the defenders of civilization are, at least in a comparative sense here. No, as you say, the detail, how you began it was very eloquent. Every time we reconsider the issue, we get into the details. But at this point, it's almost as though the details are way beyond even having to roll up our sleeves and get into. In my view, the moral issue is that clear and that clear.
Yeah. The details are a distraction. They are non-essential. Right. They are not the reason. The reason this is happening right now is not because Islamic Jihad was ready to have peace, was ready to make Gaza compete with Israel on technology and stuff. It's because this was an excuse. This was not this person starved himself to death, so now we have changed our minds and we're gonna kill some Jews. No,
I heard people talking about this guy as if he was Gandhi or Martin Luther King or something, some advocate of nonviolence. Think about it. These people are some of the most aggressive, violent, militant people on earth. They're brutal, primordial in their savage violence. They use their children as human shields. I mean, good Lord, man. And to cast that guy as some kind of idealistic, not that I favor, because Gandhi and so forth, that it only worked because it was the British Empire he was fighting, right? That kind of pacifism is just another form of sanction. But even if you do have some kind of moral glow around Gandhi, to think of this guy who starved himself as a Gandhi type figure when he is an advocate of vicious, aggressive, primitive, religious-based violence is absurd.
Yeah, we are out of time. I'm sure we'll have more episodes on this because there will be more of this, for as long as the Daily Objective is on, and or maybe not as long. Maybe eventually the Palestinians will win, and the Daily Objective will still be on.
Well, Razi, let me put it this way. I think we've given the audience, between you and I think we've given the audience a good indication of where the Daily Objective stands on this issue.
Yeah, and the audience, some of the audience seems to appreciate it. So thank you, Mary Aline, for the super chat. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you again, Jonathan. He says more Razi and James. Thanks, Mary Aline. Thank you, Free Trade. Thank you, Free Trade, also for the very generous super chat a couple days ago on James and Robert's show. Thank you, Bella. And we have some upcoming shows. So at 7 p.m., Finance Friday with Jim Brown. He'll be talking about consumer price inflation, transient trend, or enduring menace. Tomorrow, the second session of the History of Astronomy course with Joseph Tebenkin. This is for ARCUK Platinum members and above. I know a couple of members upgraded between the first session, which was open to everybody, and today. So if you haven't done that yet, I invite you to do that now. This is a course that's built, that's based on the Van Damme Academy curriculum, adjusted to adults. So it's good. And Sunday, James Valliant will be back with History of Philosophy Study Group. That is for ARCUK members, and it will be live streamed on YouTube for YouTube members. So I hope you all join us for all that. And of course, if you want to become a member or if you want to upgrade your membership, the link is in the chat. Thank you, James.
Well, thank you, Razi. And thank you, all the chats and super chats support. Really, we need you guys. And Ayn Rand Center UK is doing something amazing. Razi is doing something amazing here and important. And if you think this kind of programming is valuable, please do become a subscriber. It's very important.
Thanks. And yeah, as mentioned, we'll be back here in just over 28 minutes. So thanks and see you soon. Bye.
Be well.